Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is on the founding of the nation. I want us to look at the Articles of Confederation briefly, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So the first attempt at government by the United States was called the Articles of Confederation, and actually pictured here is John Hanson, who some have said was the first president of the United States. He really wasn't the first president of the United States because there was no president under the Articles, but the Articles nonetheless, he was the head of Congress basically. But under the Articles, which were ratified in 1781, let me just put these up here for you guys real quick. So under the Articles, which was ratified in 1781, it was the first government of the United States. There was a belief that the United States should be a unified nation, but there was a deep fear of centralized authority. Because of this fear, the authors left out any executive branch. There was no executive branch in the country. There was no Supreme Court to interpret laws on the basis of their legality or whether they adhere with the law of the land. There was only a unicameral Congress, and it required that there be unanimous consent for important things like amending the Articles. Each state had one vote, so population didn't matter. Everybody got one vote, and if you wanted to change a thing, every single state, the 13 states in the beginning, had to all agree. Congress also had no right to tax or to regulate commerce. Any problems with this? Take a second. The reality is, of course, there's obviously a lot of problems with this. There's a huge issue in the country as every state had their own currencies. They had their own debts. There was no ability for the federal government to create a cohesive international economy for the United States. And that posed a lot of problems for the United States when it came to the development of the country as a great power, because it couldn't create any kind of a consistent economy with which a foreign power like Great Britain could develop faith in and could base trade with you on. Instead, the country was very weak. It was very divided. The government was basically unfunded. The federal government was basically unfunded. So in a case of a war, it was almost impossible for them to effectively raise an army if they needed to. Federal improvements were impossible. And so there were a lot of problems from that standpoint. There's also huge problems with the fact that everybody has to agree to amend the Articles, because no one's ever going to agree totally. And amending should be difficult, but it shouldn't be unanimous, because unanimous consent is almost always impossible in a democratic society. So that kind of a clause in there meant that you would almost never change this. There's also a problem with the fact that every state had one vote. So instead of population in a larger state getting greater representation, everybody had the same representation, the same vote in terms of the nation's policies. And of course, that's rather problematic as well, as a place where there's 100 people living should not be worth the same amount of vote federally as a place in which there's 1,000 people living. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to a democratic system. So there are huge problems with this. And the problems with the government created a huge economic crisis in the country by the latter stages of the 1780s, and it led to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was called in the summer of 1787. It was called really more than anybody else by Alexander Hamilton, who you see pictured here. It was attended by James Madison, of course, Ben Franklin, George Washington, George Mason from Virginia. Were all in attendance here. Thomas Jefferson, of course, the famous Virginian, he was the ambassador to France. He was not there. The writer of the Declaration was not there. It was 55 delegates from the states to meet in secret in Philadelphia. Largely, this was a meeting of elites. More than half were college educated. They were lawyers, and they wanted to protect the status quo from the tyranny of the masses. In 1786, there had been an uprising in Massachusetts in which small farmers, led by an individual named Daniel Shays, had basically mounted um, a short-lived rebellion, in Massachusetts, and that put a lot of fear into many um, of the more, how should we say, financially well-off members of the society, that the society could fall apart and descend into kind of popular unrest amongst the people. And so in order to kind of create a stability, the powerful and the educated of the country got together largely to protect the status quo from the potential tyranny of the masses of peoples. They wanted to create a more stable system because they were afraid if they didn't create a more stable system, that there would be increasing rebellions, and people who were small farmers, for example, would increasingly try to voice their dissent to the government. And so they felt they needed a moderate government that could stabilize the country and prevent the country from being broken apart by what they saw as the tyranny of the masses. So the primary goal, again, is to create a strong central government that would limit the voice and representation of the masses of people. They wanted a limited representative republic. And Alexander Hamilton, who's on your $10 bill, really led the call for this. And this was largely to prevent rebellion and what they might have thought of as the mobocracy, mass democracy, from creating such problems that it could break the country apart. That was their fear. During the Constitutional Convention, there were several different plans that were presented. The most known and remembered were the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and ultimately the compromise that was proposed by Connecticut. The Virginia Plan had proposed a bicameral Congress, two bodies, in which population was the determining factor in who had the most representatives. New Jersey was a small state, and so the small state, Virginia is a big state. It's the biggest state at this time, and so Virginia wanted population because it would expand the representation of Virginia. It would expand their power in the government. New Jersey was a small state, and therefore they wanted to maximize their voice in the government. So the New Jersey plan was a unicameral plan with equal representation. So one body in the House, and everybody gets the same vote. Of course, the compromise of what becomes our system comes from Connecticut. Get these up here for you guys. So the basic plan that is really hatched out by Connecticut most was, as I said before, it was designed to limit what we would consider pure democracy today. It was designed to limit the eligibility of citizens to really to those who owned a certain amount of land, to those who were considered the most financially invested in the society. It created a government that was really centered around three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and of course the judicial branch, which we'll talk about later. The executive branch refers to the president, and of course, there were many, many things tossed around about what they would call the president. George Washington obviously famously said that he should be called Mr. President. He didn't want to be given a monarchical title or something, and there were some in the early founding of the country that very much thought that the United States should have something in a way of a monarchy. Of course, it doesn't happen, and instead we have a president. The president is indirectly elected, so you don't vote for the president directly. Instead, you vote within your state, and the state has electors who are appointed to cast their vote for the winning candidate of their party. So if you vote for a president in Virginia, then the electors will take the Democratic candidate who won, and they will then cast the votes as the electors. And by the way, an elector never casts their vote for somebody else. They always cast their vote for the victor. And even though theoretically they could, they don't, and there's kind of an unwritten rule that they're not supposed to cast their vote for anybody but the victorious candidate in terms of the state votes. So state electors cast the votes. The first place vote would become president, and the second place votes would become vice president. Initially, there was a huge problem with that because the vice president, the person who finished second, is probably an opposing party, and so they didn't get along very well. And so that's when, in the early 1800s, we amend the Constitution and we begin the tradition of having a president and a vice president run together and run on a ticket, so that we can avoid that problem. But the Electoral College is a way of indirectly electing the president. And again, the reason that system is developed is because the founders want to limit the nature of democracy. They want to have a stopgap in there so that, if the voice of the people is too strong and in the view of the elite wrong, they would have a way of checking that. The Senate was also indirectly elected. We don't have direct elections of senators until 1916, when we amended the Constitution then. Initially, the senators were appointed by state legislatures, and they, of course, received 6-year terms, and there's 2 of them per state. So the Senate was an equally represented body. It's the upper house in the legislature, but it's equally represented. The House of Representatives is the lower house, and this was the one place in the United States, the lower house, in which there was kind of an expansion of democracy. It's the only popularly elected body, and so all eligible voters can vote directly for their representatives, and the representatives would go to the lower house, and it would give at least one body within the government a direct voice of the people. As a result of this, too, they only serve 2-year terms, and the shorter term is again an effort by the founders to limit the ability of the masses to influence the government. The founding fathers are, in one respect, very fearful of monarchy and the tyranny of excessive power in the government. However, in many respects, they're equally as fearful of a society in which the masses of people, which they would have seen as not really educated or understanding the system, when the masses of people would dictate and control the government. That was something that the founding fathers were very fearful of. They believed, most of them, that you had to have an educated and trained kind of elite that understood what was best for the country and ruled in the best interest of the people, rather than allowing all of the people to kind of, as a mass, direct the country. There was a great fear about that in terms of the inability of the masses to direct the country from the perspective of the founders, but also because the founders believed that if you had wide swaths of less educated populace directing the country, that the country would ultimately become a morass of politicians trying to manipulate the attitudes of voters. So like a kind of a herd mentality voting. And so the founders of the country were very, very fearful of that. And that's why they created this system, which provided some expansion of direct democracy, but was largely an indirect democratic system. So again, the system, the structure of our government is a 3-branch government. There's a legislative, executive, and judicial. We can amend the Constitution, unlike the Articles. The amending does not require unanimous consent. You can amend the Constitution with 2/3 of Congress, and 3/4 of the state legislature. So it's still a big number that you have to get, but it's much more feasible than with the Articles. And as a result of that, we have amended the Constitution quite a few times, though not nearly as much as you would think. But I believe there's 27 amendments right now. Of course, there were 10 amendments to begin with. So, a relatively frequent amount, and most of the amendments have come out of the 20th century. But amending the Constitution has been incredibly, incredibly important for equality, for voter freedom, for voters' rights, for ending slavery, for providing equality before the Constitution for all people, as the Fourth Amendment does, providing suffrage to women. These are all some of the most important changes to the Constitution that were made. The executive branch, of course, is the job of the executive branch is to oversee and carry through laws. The president is the commander-in-chief, and so if there was a rebellion in which people refused to adhere to a certain law, it's the responsibility of the executive branch to see that that law is carried through, and the commander-in-chief technically could use force to see that through. George Washington is actually the only president to ever technically lead soldiers into battle, as he did during the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, I think it was. I think it was 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion, in which whiskey distillers refused to pay an excise tax on whiskey, and Washington prepared the troops, and he mounted Nelson, his horse, and rode into western Pennsylvania to force them to pay that tax. Ultimately, the rebellion, there were no shots fired, nobody was hurt. It just ended at that moment. But nonetheless, the job of the president as commander-in-chief is not only commander-in-chief in international operations, but also in overseeing and carrying through laws. The president has the power to appoint members of the government, of the judicial system, members of his cabinet. He has appointment power. He also has veto power. If Congress passes a law that is not in the interest from the president's perspective of the country, he may veto it. The legislative branch, of course, which has the power of taxation, has the right to pass laws, the right to declare war, albeit today Congress really doesn't declare war anymore. And many have argued that this is a example of expansion of executive authority in terms of making war. The last time Congress formally declared a war was actually World War II. Congress needs a two-thirds majority to overturn a presidential veto, but they can overturn a presidential veto. The judicial system, of course, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, and Supreme Court justices reserve the right to interpret the Constitution, as we've seen very, very recently with the Supreme Court's decisions on issues like marriage equality. This principle was established in the Marbury versus Madison Supreme Court case of 1801, which we'll talk a little bit more later on in the class. The ratification of the Constitution, by the way, was controversial. It took a long time. Well, not a long time, but it took a year for 9 to ratify, and it really doesn't become the law of the land until some 2 years after the convention was called. It was opposed largely by figures like Patrick Henry, pictured here, John Hancock, Sam Adams, who were anti-federalists, who believed that the Constitution was an expansion of government authority, and they opposed it. Individuals like James Madison, who's pictured here, oftentimes Madison's considered the father of the Constitution, and he was what we would call at that time a federalist. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington were all federalists who believed we needed a stronger central government to create stability for the nation as it grew and developed as a national power and as an international power. So the Federalists believed you had to have a federal government that unified the country, that could establish a national currency, that could establish economic continuity for the nation. And so, so the Constitution, the people who supported the Federalists were really the people of means. They controlled the press. The vast majority of things that were written about this issue were written in favor of the Federalist position. They were generally wealthier. They were generally more powerful. They generally controlled the means of information. And by contrast, individuals like Patrick Henry represented poorer people, smaller farmers, and they didn't control as much of the written word. And that certainly gave the Federalists an advantage. The Constitution was a compromise, by the way. It was a compromise on a number of levels, and in fact, even the Bill of Rights is a compromise. I didn't realize I had those in there, but I just said that to you guys. So let me get to the last slide here, okay? So the Bill of Rights, I mentioned the Bill of Rights was a compromise. It was demanded by many people. It wasn't in the original document, and many people opposed the Constitution because it didn't have this in there. They saw this as an expansion of the federal government, and people said, well, there's nothing to protect the government's abuse of power. So, as a result of the demands of the people, there was a creation and writing of the Bill of Rights, which was written by James Madison, again pictured here. Madison saw it as a redundant process, largely because, I say why there, I mean, why do you think Madison wouldn't find it to be, a process that was fully needed? The answer to that is really that James Madison felt that writing them down could never prevent abuses, that if you wrote them down, a government was going to abuse those rights if a government was going to abuse those rights, and that writing it down wasn't going to, prevent that abuse. Ultimately, Madison, I think, is wrong in that, because the writing down of our rights has given Americans the ability to bring legal action for the protection of our rights. It's given Americans the ability to understand more clearly when your rights are being violated. But nonetheless, the Bill of Rights is a compromise. It's included in the Constitution because many people feared that a more powerful federal government could result in a squelching of individual rights, which was a big factor. That was one of the things that motivated the revolution fundamentally. There have been violations of these liberties. We have liberties violated during the so-called Quasi-War of 1799. We have them violated during the Civil War on both sides. We have them curtailed during World War I. We have them curtailed in the 40s and 50s. And of course, they're also being curtailed right now under the Patriot Act, in which aspects of your Fourth Amendment and your Fifth Amendment particularly are, and also, of course, your right to privacy, which is not itself an amendment, but has been widely interpreted as implied within your other amendment rights. All of these have fallen under certain restrictions and clarifications amid the current war on terror. And so the Patriot Act is not the first time that amendment rights have been challenged or curtailed, though it is one of the most long-lasting cases in which you've had a formal curtailment of American civil liberties. The Bill of Rights, in brief, this is the last slide, just to run through the basics of your Bill of Rights. First Amendment, of course, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, assembly, press. Second Amendment, of course, is the right to bear arms. The amendment reads as follows, that you have the right to a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Third Amendment was the amendment against the quartering of troops. The Fourth Amendment, which the Patriot Act does certainly challenge, and you saw that in the aftermath of the manhunt during the Boston bombing, as many areas of Boston were opened up to searches without any kind of warrant, as it was dictated an act of terrorism. But the Fourth Amendment is to keep people free from unwanted search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment is the writ of habeas corpus. You cannot be tried twice. You cannot be held in perpetuity without charges being brought to you, and so forth. You can take the Fifth. You don't have to incriminate yourself. The Patriot Act, as well as other aspects of the war on terrorism, have challenged the Fifth Amendment as well recently. Guantanamo Bay is, according to many, many legal theorists, a direct challenge to the Fifth Amendment, as the people held in Guantanamo Bay have had no charges formally placed against them. Sixth Amendment, jurisprudence, still, counsel, and speedy trial. You have a right to a lawyer, basically, and you have a right to a speedy trial by a jury of your peers. Eighth Amendment is excessive bail. You can't be charged excessive bail. You can't be submitted to cruel and unusual punishments, which is where, of course, some of the controversy with capital punishment comes in. And the Ninth and Tenth Amendment are that rights not clearly stated are retained by the people and the states. So this is the basic Bill of Rights here, and over time we will amend this. Today there's 27, and we amend the Constitution to change over time to meet the needs of an evolving and changing society, and to meet the needs of equality and justice in the country. And this is how the Constitution was designed, to be changed and to adapt over time to certain needed situations. Anyway, sorry I went a little bit long today, guys. I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.